forest sang back. Freya Korhonen sat on the canopy observation deck with her legs hanging over 200 meters of open air and drew the bow across the strings of a fiddle that had been made from earth maple in a workshop in Helsinki by a luthier who had never imagined his instrument would be played in an alien forest 7,000 light years from the Baltic coast. The bioluminescent bark responded. Not immediately, not the way an audience responds, but gradually, the way water responds to a dropped stone. The vibration of the fiddle traveled through the observation deck into the trunk, and the trunk's luminous bark shifted color in response. Major key, the bark brightened, warm gold spreading upward through the vascular channels. Minor key, the bark dimmed, cooling into deep blue-green. The forest was listening, or reacting. The distinction between those two things was the question Freya's 3-year research appointment was supposed to answer. She'd been on Viridis-III for 19 months, 762 days on a planet where the trees glowed and the air tasted like ozone and honey, and the nearest human conversation that wasn't a comlink delay required a faster-than-light transit. She was lonely, the way scientists on remote postings are lonely, functionally, professionally, in the specific mode that doesn't prevent work but colors everything with the faint gray of isolation. The fiddle helped. She'd named it Kalevala, after the station, which was named after the Finnish national epic, which was itself a collection of songs about heroes and gods and a magical instrument called the kantele. Her fiddle wasn't magical. It was maple and spruce and horsehair and the muscle memory of 20 years of practice. And when she played in the canopy, the forest responded, and the response was the closest thing to companionship she'd found on Viridis-III.
Day 762. Canopy luminescence response patterns continue to correlate with tonal modulation. C major produces consistent bark brightening across observed specimens. A minor produces dimming. The correlation suggests acoustic-sensitive chromatophores in the bark structure. Or
the forest liked music. But that wasn't a sentence she could put in a research paper. The Thrynn was curled in a root hollow. 6-limbed, vine-like appendages wrapped around itself. Bark-like exodermis that should have been dark green, but was graying at the edges. Dying. Freya's xenobiology training identified the species before her emotional response finished processing. Thrynn, arboreal, solitary, Tier 2, the most aggressively antisocial sapient species in the sector. A species that considered all forms of social bonding to be pathological dependency. Its root connection, the biological link between a Thrynn and the forest's root network that provided nutrition, immune support, and biochemical stability, was severed. Black, necrotic, the severed end weeping a fluid that smelled like wet copper. Without the root connection, a Thrynn had approximately 48 hours.
Hey, can you hear me? I'm a researcher. I can help.
The Thrynn's pheromone glands activated, a chemical burst that Freya's suit translated with clinical accuracy. Solitude is health. Your proximity is a disease. Leave. Die alone. This is correct. The translation was accurate. The sentiment was species standard. Every Thrynn died alone. Every Thrynn wanted to die alone. Companionship during dying was, in Thrynn biological philosophy, a contaminant that corrupted the purity of individual existence's terminus. Freya sat down beside it anyway and stayed through the night because she was human, and humans didn't leave dying things alone, even when the dying thing insisted. Freya returned the next morning with her fiddle and a thermos of tea and the stubborn biological conviction that dying alone was wrong, regardless of what the patient's species considered correct. She didn't play to Rios. She didn't play for Rios. She played near Rios. The way she played in her quarters, for herself. The way she'd played in dormitory rooms and field stations, and the back seat of her mother's car on long drives through Finnish countryside. Music as self-comfort. Music as the sound a human makes when the silence gets too heavy and the body needs to produce something warm. The fiddle's vibration traveled through the forest floor into the root network, the massive interconnected system that linked every tree on Viridis-III, a planetary nervous system that carried biochemical signals across thousands of kilometers. The vibration entered the network the way a voice enters a hallway, attenuated, dispersed, but present. Rios's severed root connection twitched. Not dramatically, not a medical miracle, a twitch, the necrotic tissue at the severed end pulsing once in rhythm with the fiddle's lowest note. The root was dead, but the root network beneath it wasn't dead, and the vibration traveling through the network had reached the biochemical pathways that a healthy root connection would have used, and something in the forest system had responded to the input the way an ear responds to a voice, involuntarily, because the system was designed to respond and didn't know that the source was wrong.
Marko, Dr. Vesanen, I need you to check something. The root network's biochemical response to acoustic vibration. I think the fiddle is doing something.
I'm reading it. The root network's immunochemical concentration around your location has increased 17% since you started playing. Freya, the forest's immune system is responding to your music. It's sending resources to a damaged root connection because your fiddle is simulating the signal a healthy connection produces.
The Thrynn's pheromone glands activated again, but the chemical composition had shifted. The aggressive leave signal weakened, replaced by something Freya's suit translator processed with uncertainty, discomfort, unfamiliar. Why warmth? Why persist? Why persist? The question that every alien species eventually asked about humans. The question that had no evolutionary equivalent in any non-human biology the galaxy had documented. Why do you persist? Why do you stay near things that reject you? Why do you play music to dying aliens who have told you to leave? Why do you name things you can't save? Why do you cry when organisms from other planets, beings with no biological connection to your species, approach termination?
Since when are those different things?
Marko watched from the station's monitoring system, biotelemetry tracking both Freya and Rios. The human's cortisol levels were elevated, her serotonin was suppressed, her sleep quality over 6 days had degraded by 30%. Classic pack bonding stress responses, the human body investing physiological resources in the survival of a being it had decided belonged to its pack. Rios was not in Freya's pack. Rios had no concept of packs. Rios belonged to a species that would have found the word belong incomprehensible, a verb that described a relationship between an object and an owner, and Thrynn were neither objects nor owners. Freya's biology didn't care. The pack bonding instinct didn't consult the other party. It didn't require consent, reciprocity, or species compatibility. It required only proximity and time. 6 days of being near a dying being, and Freya's neurochemistry had enrolled Rios in the oldest human social program. This one is mine. I will not let this one die alone. The fiddle played. The forest responded. The dying Thrynn's root connection twitched again, twice this time, and the gray in its bark exodermis retreated by 1/2 centimeter along the left ventral surface. Not enough to matter, not enough to save, enough to mean that something was working, and that something was a Finnish woman with a maple fiddle and an involuntary compulsion to care about things that didn't want her caring. The parasite was elegant in the way that cruelty is elegant, perfectly adapted to exploit the single vulnerability that the Thrynn species had engineered into itself through 10 million years of evolutionary commitment to solitude. The parasite was called Thrynn blight in the xenobiology literature, a species-specific infection that attacked the root connection exclusively. Its life cycle was a masterwork of predatory evolution. The parasite infected a Thrynn's root connection, severed it from the forest's biochemical network, and then fed on the host's declining biochemistry as the isolated Thrynn died. The entire process took 48 to 72 hours. Clean, efficient, fatal.
Look at the infection pathway. The parasite targets the root connection's immune interface, the biochemical layer where the Thrynn exchanges signals with the forest network. It doesn't attack the Thrynn directly, it attacks the connection.
It separates the host from the network.
The insight landed with the weight of a truth that restructured the problem. The parasite's life cycle didn't require a weak host, it required an isolated host. The Thrynn blight had evolved to exploit the one guarantee the Thrynn species provided, that every infected individual would face the infection alone. No allies, no collaborative immune response, no second organism contributing biochemical support. Because Thrynn didn't do that. Thrynn were solitary. Thrynn valued isolation the way humans valued connection, as a fundamental biological good, and a parasite had evolved to weaponize that value, turning the Thrynn species' deepest conviction into a death sentence.
Readings indicate extreme biochemical anomaly. It's in
So the treatment is...
finding the source now. The data on acoustic chromatophores is undeniable, but the forest liking the music isn't a measurement. The correlation feels like a question.
The treatment required a partner, not a machine, not a pharmaceutical, a living being in sustained physical contact with the infected Thrynn for 72 hours, sharing body heat, producing the neurochemical signatures of social bonding, generating acoustic vibration through the root network. The forest's immune system would recognize the bonding chemicals and amplify its response, overwhelming the parasite with resources that isolation could never generate. The problem was simple and absolute. No Thrynn would tolerate 72 hours of physical contact with another being. The species' antisocial biology would trigger rejection responses, pheromone aggression, physical withdrawal, metabolic shutdown as the body's systems rebelled against the fundamental violation of solitary existence. No Thrynn could treat another Thrynn. The parasite had evolved to exploit exactly that limitation.
You're going to do it.
72 hours.
The frequency is clear. Ready the modulation.
Cortisol curve is dropping. We got her.
When you say it like that, it sounds insane.
It is insane. It's also the most human thing I've ever seen.
The fiddle was tuned. The thermos was filled. Freya Korhonen packed 72 hours of supplies and descended into the root network to sit beside a dying alien who didn't want her there, and she brought music and warmth and the involuntary neurochemistry of a species that couldn't stop itself from caring, and she didn't know if it would work. If you want to know whether 72 hours of stubborn human warmth can save a life that doesn't want saving, subscribe to Void Chronicles. The answer is the most human thing you'll hear today. She knew it was right, and for a human, right and rational had never been the same calculation. Hour 1 was rejection. Hour 20 was tolerance. Hour 40 was something the Thrynn had no word for, because the Thrynn had never needed one. The first 12 hours were combat. Rios' pheromone glands cycled through every rejection signal the Thrynn biological lexicon contained. Leave, contamination, disease, wrong. The chemical assault was designed to repel, evolved over 10 million years to enforce the biological conviction that proximity was pathology. Freya's suit filtered the worst of it. She stayed. Her oxytocin levels rose because her body didn't distinguish between species when deciding what to protect, and the neurochemistry of protection was indistinguishable from the neurochemistry of love. At hour 14, Freya moved close enough to touch. Her hand, skin warm at 36.8 degrees Celsius, the furnace temperature of a death worlder species that generated its own heat, pressed against Rios' bark exodermis. The contact was a violation of every Thrynn biological protocol. Rios' pheromone output spiked, the chemical equivalent of screaming. Freya didn't remove her hand. She hummed the lullaby she'd played in the canopy, the melody that made the forest brighten, and her body heat bled through the bark exodermis into the tissue beneath, and the severed root connection at the point of contact warmed by 3.4 degrees Celsius. At hour 20, the pheromone output changed. Not acceptance. The Thrynn brain didn't have receptors for acceptance. Something else. Confusion. Unfamiliar warmth. Why not pain? Why reduction in discomfort? Why do you stay? Why do you stay? The human question, asked by an alien species for the first time in recorded xenobiological history, not as philosophy, but as genuine biochemical bewilderment. The Thrynn's nervous system was processing a stimulus it had no evolutionary framework to interpret, sustained voluntary contact from another organism that produced no benefit to itself and generated measurable distress in the process. Freya's cortisol was at 22 micrograms per deciliter, clinical stress range. Her serotonin was depleted. Her sleep in 20 hours totaled 40 minutes. She was physiologically degrading in service of a species that didn't want her help, and her body's bonding systems were interpreting the degradation not as warning, but as investment. At hour 36, the forest's immune response reached threshold. The acoustic vibration through the root network, sustained for 36 continuous hours by a fiddle and the voice that hummed when her hands were too exhausted to play, had generated a biochemical signal that the forest interpreted as a bond. Not a Thrynn bond. Thrynn didn't bond. A new bond. An unprecedented signal that the forest's immune system processed as, organism in hollow is connected. Organism is not alone. Send resources. At hour 48, the parasite began to die, starved. The Thrynn blight's life cycle depended on isolation, on the guarantee that no exterior organism would provide the biochemical support the host needed. The forest's immune resources, amplified by bond chemistry signals the parasite had no defense against, overwhelmed the infection the way an immune system overwhelms any invader when it receives the signal that the organism is worth saving. At hour 60, Rios' pheromone output produced a compound that Freya's suit translator processed for 14 seconds before returning a result. Stay. One word. The first word of acceptance a Thrynn had ever produced for another living being. One word that represented the first crack in 10 million years of evolutionary solitude. Not because the solitude was wrong, but because a human had demonstrated through 72 hours of stubborn, irrational, biologically compulsive presence that connection was not contamination. At hour 72, Freya Korhonen, exhausted, dehydrated, emotionally spent, cortisol elevated, serotonin depleted, every physiological indicator suggesting she should have left 60 hours ago, sat against a dying alien that was no longer dying and played a Finnish folk melody on a fiddle made of earth maple and felt, in the bioluminescent glow of an alien root network 7,000 light years from Helsinki, the specific warmth of home. Not the home she'd been counting down to return to. The home she'd built in 8 days by doing the most human thing her species knew how to do, refusing to let a stranger die alone. Rios didn't become social. Thrynn biology didn't transform overnight, but as the recovered alien climbed the root structure toward the canopy, the first movement in 8 days, one vine-like appendage reached back and touched Freya's shoulder. One touch, brief, the first voluntary contact a Thrynn had ever initiated with another species. In the bark exodordes along Rios' dorsal ridge, visible only at the angle where the bioluminescent light caught it, the pattern of crystallized cells had arranged into a shape that Marco, watching from the station monitors, identified with quiet wonder, the sound wave visualization of a Finnish folk melody. The song was in the bark. The bond was in the body. The human had written herself into an alien's biology through nothing more than presence and music and the refusal to leave. Freya Korhonen packed her fiddle, climbed to the canopy, and played at dawn. The forest sang back, and somewhere below, in the root network, a solitary being who had never known connection carried a melody in its skin and didn't mind.